for us to begin this morning. We're grateful that you're here. I'm going to have to go ahead and apologize in advance. I have finally caught something this winter here, which I feel okay, but I sound terrible. So I asked Robert to make me sound better. I don't think he can through the microphone system. So you guys have to suffer doubly because you'll have to hear me this morning in class and then again during the worship hour. But I think we'll be okay. Been trying to keep the cough drops and water nearby, but I apologize in advance. I sound like I got all kinds of stuff stuck up here like a lot of folks do this time of year. If you have your Bible handy, you can be turning to the book of Exodus. In Exodus chapter 1, we're going to shift our thinking today over from the story of the life of Joseph to the life of Moses. To begin this morning, I'm going to try to get a little video to play. And by that, I told Robert I was going to make him earn his money this morning. And now I see that he's done it on Cameron. So I feel bad for Cameron up there, but we'll see. But it's from, just to set it up real quick, it's from Polishing the Pulpit. I'm not sure what year, actually, now that I think about it. I didn't pay attention to. But using their 365 service, in which you can always get on, and if you're a part of that, and see all kinds of content from years past, including all kinds of material that they have put out through that. I know Justin Savannah had been up at the marriage retreat this weekend, and those are usually put up there when they're done. The videos that are recorded are there. And so it's just a great resource. I like to pull from it from time to time when I can to show you a little bit about what it looks like. They've even done something this year where they're taking some of their keynote sessions and making a whole handout that you can follow along with, discussion questions. You watch the video and then you could use it as part of a class material. So I've been excited to see all that they do there. But what I'd like to show you is a short video. Again, within the last couple of years, Dr. Justin Rogers, who is the head of the Bible department at Freed-Hardeman currently, spoke, and he did a 3-part series on the book of Exodus. So we're going to try to, of course, we're not covering the whole book, but we're going to have about 7 weeks in the life of Moses. But he begins this session on the first 19 chapters. I feel bad for him trying to cover 19 chapters in about 45 minutes, but he's got about 5 minutes, just about 5 minutes is all we're going to watch, where he introduces the book a little bit and talks about what we know about Egypt. And number one, he says it way better than I can. I could have, of course, copied down word for word what he said and read it back to you. But I want to be sure to give him credit. He does such a great job. Secondly, I hope you'll listen critically, because what he does is explain there are some things that we don't know. And that doesn't have to shake our faith. And all I can think of is the fact that this spills over very well into what we've talked about on Wednesday nights with how we got the Bible. What we've emphasized through that class is not that we don't know or we can't know, but there are certainly things that have occurred over the span of thousands of years that we weren't there for every step of the way. And that's not meant to shake our faith, but it's even meant to be more encouraging. But I think Justin does just a great job of setting that up. So again, we're going to watch just about the first 5 minutes of his lecture. Hopefully.
This is a session 1 of 3 on the book of Exodus. So for the next several days, we'll try to survey the book of Exodus. Probably won't be able to cover your favorite verse, unfortunately, in great detail. But we are going to try to cover the entire book. And I'll try to do it in a way that gives a representative sample of what this book is really about, not only in terms of what the book says about itself, but also in the context of the Hebrew Bible as a whole. The first thing that I want to point out, though, is historical in nature. And that is that a lot of people, and you may not be aware of this, a lot of scholars, critical scholars, do not believe the Exodus from Egypt actually ever happened. The reason they don't believe that is because there is very little evidence that Israel was ever in the land of Egypt. Archaeological evidence, historical references to the Israelites in Egyptian literature, they're just non-existent. And not only that, we don't exactly know where any of these major geographical markers where the events took place actually were. Believe it or not, we do not know where the Red Sea is. In fact, the Hebrew word Yam Suf means sea of reeds, literally. So it could describe any number of bodies of water in this particular area. We have no idea which one. You add to that the complication that we know from geological surveys and now with ground penetrating radar and satellite imagery, we know the geology of the Sinai Peninsula is vastly different now than it was 3,500 years ago, and that only complicates things further. We don't know where Mount Sinai is. Paul in Galatians 4 says it's in Arabia. So either Paul had a very definition of what constituted Arabia from any other ancient author, or it's not where the Catholic Church says that it was. That'd be the first time they've been wrong about anything. But that's what we call Mount Sinai today typically, may not actually be where it is. Not to mention all the stops that the Israelites made on the wilderness journey. Massah, Marah, Kibrot Chatavah, Rephidim. Nope, none of those. We don't know where any of this happened. I remember a few years ago, I was in a public lecture and one of the most famous archaeologists on the Egyptian Exodus was giving a presentation citing all sorts of circumstantial evidence that he had turned up through his excavations that could be explained as being connected to the Israelites. And after he was finished, a hand went up in the back and he said, I hear you saying all of this and it's all circumstantial and you admit that and I appreciate that. But here's the thing. How do you know it even happened? And the guy was confused. Here he was at a Jewish school and people are questioning the very nature of the Exodus, the foundational historical moment of their history. And that's where a lot of people are. Are we even sure that there was an Exodus? Now, I am, but that's because the Bible says so, and I don't think I need a whole lot more evidence than that. There's more to it than that, but that's not our purpose. I just want to point out to you that if you start to read the commentaries, especially that are written by critical scholars, you sort of need to know what you're wading into because you might find some things that are a little different than you expect. Well-known biblical minimalist by the name of Philip Davies, who taught for a long time at the University of Sheffield in the UK, this is what he says. When it comes to the Exodus, we have no evidence that it happened and a good deal of evidence that it didn't. They made it up. Well, that's pretty plain. Thank you very much. But there is a reason to believe it happened. The Old Testament authors, not only in the Pentateuch, but beyond, take it as a foundational historical event marking the birth of the nation, hence our title. The New Testament authors believe that it actually happened and talked about it as a historical event. There was a Moses, there was a Mount Sinai, even though we don't know where it is. There was a 10 Commandments. And those events form the backbone of the rest of the Hebrew Bible. In fact, other than creation, Exodus is the second most common theme in the Hebrew Bible. It matters. And the fact that it happened matters. So let's dig into this text together. We start in chapters 1 and 2 by talking about the Egyptian oppression. And what you notice
such a great job of presenting the material, but also just something that is good to consider. I've got some PowerPoint. We'll try to see if Cameron can get it pulled back up for me there. For us this morning, it's not real detailed, but will be something that will be hopefully encouraging for us as we move over to the Old Testament. It's still in Old Testament 3, but from the life of Joseph to the life of Moses. Just a couple of notes there on what Justin had to say. Dr. Rogers, it's weird. I played basketball at Justin High School, so I have a hard time calling him Dr. Rogers, but he certainly is that. And as you could hear, I love listening to Dr. Rogers because when he pronounced those names of those stops along the wilderness journey, you can hear the Hebrew. I don't know what it's called there, Freddie, but the putting the emphasis on the syllables and things, and he can do that really well because I believe his doctorate and stuff was in going to school for Hebrew, and so he is very great when it comes to all that. But what strikes me is you watch the first 2 or 3 minutes of that, and it's almost challenging. It's like, wait a minute, you mean to tell me we don't know? You mean to tell me we're not sure? That if we're being honest about it, there's some things we don't know? But then by the time he comes around to the end, he makes you feel confident, the things that we've already talked about. Where's the ark? Where's Noah's ark? Well, we don't know. And does that shake our faith? Where are some of these other things that we've talked about in various classes that emphasize the fact that we don't have every single shred of piece of history of every single thing along the way, And that doesn't have to be something that is faith-shattering, but hopefully it builds up your faith. To understand that there have been changes, and we've even used this illustration of the Hittites. For a long time, the Hittites were not found. And people believe the Hittites were made up by Scripture or made up by the Bible until we did find something. So it may eventually be the case that we come across something of an archaeological nature in which we say, okay, it shows the Israelites and the Egyptians, were together, and there was this period of Exodus. But even as we have used in our Wednesday night classes, the idea of both the external evidence of the Scripture and the internal evidence, what the Old Testament had to say, what the New Testament had to say, and he points out the fact that that's exactly what they say. They hold it up as, this is the evidence. This is the very backbone of the birth of a nation. They talked about it as their kids went along. And so I don't want you to be confused. I didn't pull any maps for our study this morning. But you say, wait a minute, preacher, you put a map up there and it says that's where the Red Sea is. Why are you saying that the Red Sea is not there? I'm not saying that. I think we have good ideas. We have best guesses as we look at those things, and there's other probably reasons why, as he alluded to. He's got other reasons why he believes in Exodus. He doesn't have time to go to in that particular class. So we will use what we believe we know and kind of what those have tried to deduce from history and historical facts. But I also almost always periodically say, you need to be careful of, and I'll use my fingers, scholars, right, in quotation marks, scholars. People that think they've got it all figured out, think they're smarter than everybody else, that'll come along and say, well, I have studied for years, and I'm telling you it didn't happen, so it must not have happened. Well, there are scholars, true biblical scholars, who studied these things. There are others who come into it with some kind of bias, or they're trying to have some kind of their own agenda. And so I don't think most of you are going to probably pick up a book or a commentary in which is going to, refute the Exodus. But as his point was, in case you do, it's helpful to know there are people that say this, yet there are certainly reasons to believe it, even outside of just the fact that if God said it, it's so. Any comments or questions there? Freddie, you want to add anything? Sure. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. All right, so thinking about this idea of Moses, and really we're going to cover the birth of Moses, Exodus chapter 1, into the first 10 verses of chapter 2 is where we're going to try to go today. I always tell you how much I didn't like math when I was in school, but we have to start with math this morning. Verse number 1 begins with a bridge of sorts. In fact, the first 7 verses of Exodus chapter 1 is a bridge of sorts. I'm told, because I'm not a Hebrew scholar, that in the Hebrew Bible, that the first word of Exodus chapter 1 and verse 1 is a conjunction. It is a continuation. And so we do not need to miss the fact that as you close out the book of Deuteronomy, and Joseph died, or excuse me, the book of Genesis. Book of Genesis, Joseph died being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. Now, it's a conjunction. It's carrying over these thoughts. The first 7 verses are a bridge of sorts as we think about this household that has now moved. And there is the list of the 11 in the first 4 verses there that tell us the ones that came over. And of course, then in verse number 6, the all-important phrase, and they died. And they died. It sounds kind of harsh, doesn't it? I mean, Joseph's just spent, we've just spent all kinds of chapters, 23 or so chapters, 20 to 23 chapters, studying the life of Joseph and all that he went through. And we know some about these folks as well, but very simply put, and they died. I saw one writer who suggested, though, that this is also how God sees the passage of time. It's just a fact. Joseph was wonderful and great in what he did and how he was used by God providentially, but God is there when a generation arrives on the scene. God is there as that generation lives out their lives, and he is still there when they die and pass on. and so on, and so on, and so on. This is how God understands the passage of time. He can be saddened to a sense, in a sense, whenever one of his faithful servants passes away. But at the same time, it's just the passage of time so long as he sees fit. They're born, they live, and they die. The same thing that happened to Joseph and his brothers and his father will be the same thing that happens to all of us if the earth continues to stand. Now, we may die young in our consideration. We may live a full life. There could be any number of things. We could die tragically, and they die. So, verse number 5 says, you do the math. You know, when we think about this number, verse 5 tells us that it's 70 persons. And of course, it reminds us that Joseph was already in Egypt. You know how it goes, right? Whether it's the idea of a pyramid scheme or whatever kind of thing, that 2 times the result, you get to a big number pretty quickly, right? That's kind of the idea of the way those schemes work. If I, as one, find 2 and those 2 find 2, we multiply pretty quickly. In Numbers chapter 2 and verse 32, we mentioned this a few weeks ago, but Numbers chapter 2 and verse 32, it tells us that the number of those who were of fighting age were 603,550 fighting men. So we might say in summary, Goshen, the land of Goshen to which they moved to, was filled with Israelites. Now, as we're going to see when we get into the 10 plagues here in a couple of weeks, they were not necessarily spread out everywhere. They were pretty much confined to that area that was known as Goshen. We believe that it was kind of this northeastern area. More on that in just a moment. We used a map last week to kind of show that. But basically, it was brimming with Israelites. The land was filled. They were just multiplying. It's worth noting here a few things I don't necessarily have on the screen, but Genesis closes, and this is why this number is important, this math is important. Genesis closes, and they are in the minority. And by the time Exodus opens, they are great in number pretty quickly. Genesis closes, and they are in favor with the nation, the host nation, and they are free, so to speak, as Genesis closes. Exodus opens, and they are out of favor, and they are in bondage. And so there's also a couple of fulfillments here, if you will. I mentioned this one before, but if you go back to Genesis chapter 15 and verse 13, this is God's covenant with Abram. We mentioned this a few weeks ago, Genesis 15 and verse 13. Then he, that's God, said to Abram, know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs. Check, got that. And will serve them, that's here or coming, and they will afflict them 400 years. And so, number one, this is a fulfillment of the fact that they will be in servitude, and they will be afflicted for about 400 years. The other one is in Genesis chapter 46, and verse number 3. Genesis chapter 46 and verse 3. This is that occasion in which Jacob has packed up and he is ready to go because the sons have come home and said, you know, we've had this moment with Joseph. We found this brother we thought was dead. Jacob packs up. They're going to move to the land of Goshen or over to Egypt. And as he stopped, as they exited the promised land, that area, that would be the promised land, their homeland for sure, he stops and he worships God. Verse 3, he says, I am God, the God of your father. Do not fear to go down to Egypt, for I will make of you a great nation there. So as we read over that a few weeks ago, it was pretty just, you know, we just hit it, we moved on. Just kind of talks about it and we move on. But it's a prophecy of sorts. And here we see this fulfillment. So when we talk about the great God of heaven who's doing so many things, he's constantly working. And in various ways, here are two ways in which two fulfillments happen in this very first section. So, verse 7, but the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly. I'm told that word that's used there in the original language in verse 7 has that, and it's used in other places to be translated as swarming. You know, we don't think of humans often as swarming. You know, maybe in a sports sense, they're swarming to the ball, maybe kind of thing, the person who has the ball. But we certainly think of it with insects. A lot of times, multitude of insects swarm of insects. So the children of Israel were fruitful, they increased abundantly, multiplied, grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. And then verse 8, now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. So God has blessed Jacob and his family. He has blessed them. But with blessing, there is sometimes not good things that come. There is bad that comes sometimes with the blessing. Oftentimes, if a person had 12 sons in this day and age, there's probably a good chance that not all of them are going to live. You think about, we've talked about the technological advancements we have, the medical advancements we have in this life. We can do so much. You got sick of certain things, you died then. And so to see that 12 sons would live is not a miracle. Somebody might use that term. It's not just a miracle, but it is very unlikely that all 12 sons would make it to this point, and that their offspring, that this family would continue. But with the fact that they survived, hooray, yay, they survived. Now here comes the bad part again. Now we know from the study of Joseph, their lives were not perfect. Now the brothers didn't exactly suffer a whole lot, but they certainly went through what they went through with Joseph, the suffering of thinking about that for a long time, then the good of being reunited and moving to Egypt. But here comes the bad. Let me ask you, have you ever been a part of a regime change in life? Or maybe where you worked? I mean, I know we kind of go through this ever so often in our country, right? Whenever the presidential office changes parties, it's a bit of a regime change, or we feel like, things are going to start going the opposite direction. Maybe you've dreaded that before at a place that you work. You ever had a boss that was changing? Nick now works, I've mentioned this several times, Nick now works where I did at Steel Warehouse there on Amnicola. And the funny thing about Steel Warehouse, in one sense, as far as the politics of the office and the way that it worked, was we in Chattanooga were an office of ourselves, and we were kind of tied, in a sense. For a while we were what was called Steel Warehouse of Tennessee. We were tied to a plant in Memphis. So the rest of the company, and it was a pretty good sized company, is a pretty good sized company, was spread out around the kind of eastern United States and southeast, but Memphis and Chattanooga were together. But the company started in South Bend, Indiana. And of course, that's where the bosses are, that's where the board is, that's where a lot of higher ups are, that's where the headquarters, it resides still in South Bend, Indiana. Anybody around here ever had to deal with any Northerners? I'm sorry to any Northerners I might offend here, but anybody deal with any Northerners? It was kind of a joke around our office in Chattanooga, because here we are, we've got Southern hospitality, right? We take care of each other. I mean, we don't all agree on politics, we don't all agree on religion, but it's the South, we got Southern hospitality. And one of the fears, and maybe it was just my fear more than anybody, but of course one of the fears was that, hey, eventually our, office executive or our vice presidents or the head of the office are going to either quit or move on to something different, and we're going to get somebody new in. And what are we going to do if somebody from way far up north comes down and tries to tell us what to do? Because, it was even funny. You could get on the phone. We'd have, conference calls, weekly conference calls, and you could tell when somebody from the South was talking on the conference call, and you could tell when somebody from the North was talking on the conference call. They talk more like Joel does, very quickly, and moving on from time to time. I'm making stereotypical jokes here, but it was kind of true that we were always a little nervous of, man, we've kind of got our way of running things and what we like. Everybody knows everybody, and everything fits well. And what are we going to do when there's finally a regime change? That's a long way around to say what takes place here is a regime change, and there's going to be a problem because somebody new comes in, and there is this idea of what are we going to do now? Now, of further interest, and by the way, the PTP 365, I'm always willing and ready, able to help you if you have interest in accessing that. We'll try to help you, but if you go through and watch the rest of those videos, Justin talks about this for just a moment real quickly, and then he moves on to like chapter 8, and he's having to move to get through that material. But one of the things he mentions in the next section of that video was that a further interest is there is believed through historical facts to have been a set of kings or even pharaohs who reigned over the land of Egypt during this time. Hyksos, or something along those lines, the Hyksos kings is how you would think about it. They were possibly Canaanite kings. All right, you understand what I'm saying here? Might have been a group of people who came down from the land of Canaan, from what we would call that homeland, down to Egypt, and they took over the land of Egypt for a while. And that may have been why Joseph and his friends and family endured such favor, because they speak the same language. We're from the same part of the world. We've got some kind of, friendship here, even if we're not the same people. But maybe that was who was ruling over Egypt during this time. They came down, they grew in number, similar to the Israelites, grew in number enough to where they took over and ruled in Egypt for a while, until the Egyptians eventually flipped the script. Right? They grew up in strength and number and took back over. And so maybe that's what we see here, just kind of taking history and reading it into this a little bit. And so when we think about that, then now there is a Pharaoh who comes up who says, he says a couple things, or it could be a couple things. Number one, he could say, I don't care, right? I didn't make a deal. I didn't make this deal, so I don't care. Or he could just simply not know. He just, simply doesn't quite understand. But either way, he comes up with a plan, right? And plan number one is, let's make them work. Let's make them work. Now, it's interesting. I've got it on the screen here, but they go from honored guest to national security threat pretty quickly, don't they? They go from, hey, come into the land of Egypt and we will all live together and work together, to, wait a minute, now these folks are a threat to our national security. We're concerned about what they would do. Let me remind you again, I mentioned this, I don't have a map today, but the land of Goshen would have been in the northeast, we believe, area there, the Nile River Delta. And so anyone coming from the Canaanite area, the land of Canaan area, to take over Egypt would have to pass right through the Israelites, and might say, hey, while we're coming through, why don't y'all just join us? Why don't we just get together and do this? We want to take them down. We understand that they are causing trouble for you. Let's just work together to defeat the Egyptians. And so, that's certainly a possibility here. And of course, it's always true. How fast memory fades, all right? How fast history is forgotten. Absolutely. But I was just fixing to say, Freddie, you're on the right track, or we're on the same track here. Freddie says it's a short time compared to the 250 for the United States to 400 for them. And of course, I think too as well, we're going through the same challenges. Like we're looking back at history and not wanting to repeat it in some ways, right? We're looking back at things that we want to avoid. And it's just true how soon history is forgotten by people. How soon memory fades when you think about these things, and you find yourself repeating the same mistakes of people in the past. And so it's absolutely true as we think about these first 14 or so verses. I've read a few verses. We won't have time to go through all of them, but notice as you look down there, verses 9 through about verse 14, the things that they're going to do. Set taskmasters, verse 11. Verse 12, they're going to afflict them. Verse 12, they were in dread of the children of Israel. And verse 13, so the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor. They made their lives bitter with hard bondage. So we can note here that whatever the role or task was exactly, it was hard. It was difficult. Pharaoh's plan number one, at least part one, was to kind of kill them off in a sense, without having to murder them, or to stunt their growth in such a way that, stunt their reproductive growth. Now again, not quite exactly physically, but if they're so worn out and they're so tired and the people are so beat down, surely they will stop this growth. But as we read a moment ago, what does it say there in verse 12? The more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. Now, the fact that God oversaw this plan, this so-called plan, the fact that God was overseeing all of this isn't what happened. His plan is not going to work. It was absolutely cruel, but they did continue to grow. So, as we have talked about providence a little bit, here we are again, seeing God's providence at work. What is meant to be bad turns out for good in the sense that they continued to grow. That's kind of a break there. Any comments or questions on this section about the work they were put under? basically. And maybe less so or more so, less so that they would have time, again, reproducing the same way. Victor, you can say that? Yeah. Yeah. Mhm. We got our military row here, at least a couple of them. Josh and Victor, let them attest to the fact that it's absolutely true. I mean, it's going to back. It's kind of meant to backfire in a sense, not to him, but there's a sense in that training way. There's a reason why we don't have that many Navy SEALs or that many Marines or Rangers and folks that go through that, because what they put them through. I mean, of course, I think it's the SEALs they quite literally call Hell Week, and things like that to say how hard it is, but it's to hone in to make these folks ready for battle. And they don't have to do battle in the same way, but it's going to strengthen them in the same way that's done. Real quick, because we're going to run out of time, but Pharaoh's Plan Part 2. So as we've said already, Part 1's not going very well, right? They are not only not growing or shrinking, but they are doing quite the opposite. And so picking up in verse number 15 then, Pharaoh's Plan Part 2 is to find a few of these ladies that Freddie introduced to us a couple years ago as lost in the credits. Some of you may remember that. Freddie, it's been probably many years ago now. I might pull it out again, Freddie. But Freddie did that sermon series years ago. I took it and used it at Saudi for a little while when I first started. But some of these folks that we know very little about, but yet had a big impact. And so these two Hebrew ladies, these two Hebrew midwives, verse 15 gives us their names, tell us a little bit about them, even though we don't know very much. They would be considered lost in the credits. Now, no doubt they're probably not the only two. There is a chance that maybe they are potentially the lead two, the head nurses of some sort there. And so, hold your space right there and go to Acts chapter 5. Acts chapter 5. And because I'm going to have you go to two passages in Acts real quick. So I'll just mention these. Acts chapter 5, this is a bit of a call ahead, right? It's not a call back, but a bit of a call ahead to what would happen in Acts chapter 5 and verse 29 when Peter and the other apostles answer these leaders as they are on trial. Verse 24 tells us that it's before the high priest and the captain of the temple and the chief priest that Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than men. And while you're there, look over at Acts chapter 7, and let me tell you that this is your homework, all right? We'll reference it a lot over the next few weeks, but if you want to do a little homework or be thinking about this some more, look at Acts chapter 7. This is Stephen's great sermon that he preaches before he is killed, as we've been talking about Saul and Paul on Sunday nights. But Acts chapter 7, verse 9, and the patriarchs, becoming envious, sold Joseph into Egypt. So you pick up there in verse number 9, and you go all the way through almost not the rest of the sermon total, but down through certainly verse 37, down through maybe verse 43 or so. That's a little bit of homework for you. Stephen's sermon before he is murdered and covers a lot of this time in Egypt and Moses. And so we'll call about that and call attention to that a few times as we work through this material. So I have here on the screen, but we've looked at Pharaoh's Plan Part 1, Pharaoh's Plan Part 2, but now here's God's plan, right? God's plan going along with not only the rest of the chapter 1, but into chapter 2. The midwives fear God. They did not do, verse 17 of chapter 1, as the king of Egypt commanded them, but save the male children alive. Now, there is a great question here that unfortunately we're just going to have time to touch on, but I would be more than happy to discuss it with you further. I'd be more than happy to share the material that I have on this. But there is a discussion here often, even as Freddie and I were talking about so-called scholars who say that here is lying. The Hebrew midwives were lying, and that God is giving the thumbs up, right? Stamp of approval to lie, which is not the case. That's certainly not what happens here. There is this fact that they don't do what the king of Egypt commanded them. And this is where I mentioned that call ahead to Acts chapter 5 in verse 29. Essentially, they're going to say the same thing. This is at least their belief from what we understand here. We're going to obey God rather than men. And so they are not condoned, or they are not, commended for any kind of deceit here, but they're commended for their action. They're commended for saying, we're not going to murder babies. That's a whole other topic too for another time there, but that's what they're commended for here. What they say is also a biological fact. The women who were accustomed to heavy physical activity, they usually have a lesser difficulty in delivery. And so this may be an explanation that allowed the midwives to, avoid having to tell the king the higher motive. Because what they say is, this is a biological fact. These Hebrew women are having these babies sooner than we can get there. And we don't have any more detail than that. I think the New King James, there's some versions that call them lively. There are some versions, that's verse number 19. There are some that call them vigorous. But these Jewish women are said to have been different. And so there is this thing that's occurring in the delivery that is causing this to not have to be so. While it's also true that the women, these Hebrew midwives, are saying, we don't want to murder these babies. We're not going to murder these babies. We ought to obey God rather than men. That's essentially what they're saying here. And so, I looked at a couple commentaries. Again, this is another great thing to go to ChristianCourier.com. Brother Wayne Jackson has a pretty brief article about what takes place here. And so, don't get caught up in anybody who might point this out as saying, well, they're lying and God is okay with their lie. He's commending their actions for what they're doing, or not willing to do, not willing to kill the babies. But they may have also, told the truth in this way when they were asked about what was occurring. So that's the end of chapter 1 there. Chapter 2 then is God's plan. Pharaoh's had his, and his plan is Moses. Chapter 2 begins with telling us that Moses is born. Well, let me say this real quick, sorry. Look at the end of chapter 1, verse 22. Pharaoh continues, and the age-old phrase that's an age-old phrase to us, right? But if at first you don't succeed, try again, right? That's meant to be encouraging. But Pharaoh does the same thing, although in a negative slight. Here he says, verse 22, he commanded all his people, saying, this is what you shall do. So he's not going to give up. Part 1 didn't work. Part 2 doesn't seem to be working, but he's not quitting. And maybe we see here what we're going to read later, the challenge of when Pharaoh hardens his own heart. That's another challenging discussion from this section of Scripture when we get into the plagues that people sometimes bump up against, is this idea of the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. Well, here Pharaoh begins, there's a few ways that's mentioned. One of those is Pharaoh does it himself. He does it to himself. And maybe this is setting the stage, because even though somebody else might look at all this and say, well, maybe this is God's plan. Now, he didn't believe in the God of heaven. He believed in a bunch of gods, right? All kinds of gods, what he thought. So, but somebody else might look back at this and say, well, maybe this is something, maybe I should quit. No, he's going to double down. He's going to try again and try to exterminate, without just lining them up and murdering them, the Israelites. So, then comes along Moses. Chapter 2, God's plan. Pharaoh had a plan to limit growth and to oppress. That was Pharaoh's plan. But God had a plan to liberate. We notice here at the beginning of the chapter that Moses' parents are mentioned. Verse 1 says, a man of the house of Levi went and took as wife a daughter of Levi. We're not going to find out later. I think it's chapter 6. I thought I wrote that down. But later into chapter 6, what his parents' names are. Yes, it's the back part of chapter 6 where we get a bit of lineage, and we find out about his parents and their names there. But in chapter 2 and verse 1 and 2 here, we don't see their names. Now, once again, something else that people might bump up against, this is a bit of a close marriage. And by close, I don't mean what Justin and Savannah just went through, where they went to marriage retreat and they tried to get closer to one another. I mean, this is a blood kind of close, right? They're related fairly closely in this line. Now, if you're making notes, you like to jot notes down, I don't know if it'd be in your Bible anywhere, but it's Leviticus chapter 18 where this idea of a close marriage becomes forbidden. It's permissible for a while, People often have questions about how do you multiply the earth when there's only a few people. Well, it was permissible for a while, but then there is forbidden as we get the law of Moses, Leviticus chapter 18. There is this closeness in marriage is forbidden. So we see in verse number 2 that he was different, right? What does it say? When she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him 3 months. So I ask you the question, did they know? You know, we asked this question with Joseph. Did Joseph know at all what was happening? Did he at any point say, well, this is God's providence. I really don't care that I'm in prison. This is what God has. This is for better good. Probably not, but did he know? Well, maybe they did know a little because of how he was different, at least somewhat different. Did Moses know? Now, the one thing that is sometimes asked here or maybe mentioned or questioned is that maybe there was a vision, kind of like we read about in the early stages of the Gospels, right, with both John the Baptizer's parents and Jesus' parents, that there was this vision explaining. Maybe there was here. We do not know because we are not told. I'm not trying to suggest something that's outside of Scripture. It doesn't say they ever had that. What I will tell you is, I'll let you cheat on your homework. You want to cheat on your homework? Acts chapter 7 and verse 25, right in that section I told you to go read, says that Moses supposed that his brethren would have understood that God would deliver them by his hand. What does that mean? Well, it means that maybe he did have an inkling. Whether he had a vision or they had a vision, I don't know. But at some point he's saying, wait a minute, don't y'all know I'm the chosen one? Don't you know that I'm supposed to be the one that's going to deliver you? But they didn't. And so, you know, maybe there was something, there seems to be something different here about him. I'm not suggesting that he was shining in any kind of way or what that beautiful looks like. But here's one thing we know for sure. He's pretty normal, because by 3 months, you can't keep it a secret anymore. I don't think we've got any 3 months old in here anymore, but Wes can attest to the fact not too long ago, and even still a little bit, that the healthy lungs of a healthy baby are sometimes hard to hide, you know, especially at 2 o'clock in the morning or 3 o'clock in the morning. You can't hide a baby that long with healthy lungs. Or I even saw one writer that suggested eventually maybe the clothesline would give them up, right? Now there's diapers or clothing around of some sort that maybe would give up this family and what their secret was. But either way, you know, comes time, they can't keep a secret for long because they're going to have to make a change. So verse 3 says, when she could no longer hide him. Of course, the next thought we have here is, ark, anyone? How awesome. You know, I don't know if you ever thought about it before, but isn't it really pretty neat? One of those things in Scripture to see that here comes an ark again. As we talked about earlier this morning, we mentioned the ark of Noah. This is the very same word that's used in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 14. Now make thee an ark of gopher wood. Now I'm going to go out on a limb here. I'm going to say I think that the dimensions are a little different, right? I think the dimensions might have been slightly different. The materials are slightly different. It tells us in verse number 3 what she used. I wanted to use a picture because, you know, those are sometimes beneficial. And the picture that I have, I think I've mentioned before, is a website that's called Free. It's called Free Bible Images. And they're put together and you can use them for PowerPoint or classes or things. But it's challenging when they, you know, use some effort, as that first picture showed, a man standing there with a burning bush. There's some challenges. And so you can dress people up. You know, you can make them look like we think they might have looked during that time. But you can't do everything. And so the picture of the basket, you know, looked like something my wife goes and buys at Target, you know, over the weekend. So I was like, well, I don't think I'm going to use that picture. But we do get an inclination here of what she used. It's an ark. And it's pretty neat to think about salvation by an ark. Salvation inside of something, even as we spent last year talking about types and antitypes. So verse 5 through 9 tells us that they put Moses in a safe space. Now, I've got in quotation marks on the screen here because that's a bit of a catchphrase today, right? A bit of a hot word or phrase that's used sometimes. Say, well, this is a safe space, you know, where you can come and and you don't have to worry about, people being mean to you or anything like that. But isn't it interesting to know we got a new bell? I wonder what that thing was. And I thought maybe I just smelled, and they were trying to tell me that I needed an air freshener up here. But look at us now. All right. I don't go over. I'm not the one in trouble for going long sometimes. Anyways, this is a safe space. What do we mean by that? Well, it's where Pharaoh's daughter is going to be. I read something that said that there might have even been sharks in these waters. Now, I don't know if that was a mistranslation. I don't know if I was misreading, but it said there might have even been sharks in some of these waters. We certainly might envision that there might have been crocodiles or something along the nature of that. But if it's a place that the president's daughter is going, right, in our terms, that Pharaoh's daughter is going, it's going to be a safe space. It's going to be protected. And so there is this almost providential, but also even family idea here that they know where to put him. And so that's where they're going to, she's going to find this ark in a safe space where there's not really a fear about the wrong party coming along. You leave that ark in another section of the river, Moses is probably dead. He's pulled out by the wrong person and he's killed right there on the spot. I want you to think about this idea of God's providence. I hope that you understood from last week. I'm not trying to, God's providence it's a mind-bending thing. And I had a few conversations afterwards, and I think we all understand each other, but I'm not trying to take away God's power. God's providence is working. We can prove it from Scripture. The problem is, as I've said, the proximity to it sometimes. When we're too close to it, it's hard to say for sure sometimes. But I'm not trying to take it away. Is this God's providence continuing to work? He's in a safe space as they get ready to sort of release him here. And then we find what I deem successful Moses, right? We see there in verses 9 and 10 that he was powerfully influenced by two women, both his mother, Jochebed, and by Pharaoh's daughter. And just to help you cheat a little bit more on your homework, I'm giving you all the answers here. Acts chapter 7 and verse 22 says, "And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds." We brought this up when we talked about Joseph. There's no doubt Joseph took on some form of the Egyptians. I'm not suggesting he began to worship the other gods or so-called gods, that he did all of that, but whether he dressed, whether his voice changed, his dialect changed, joking about northerners and southerners again, whether that happened or not, it may have. Moses takes on some form of the Egyptians, and he's successful. Josephus, right? We've talked a lot about Josephus lately. Josephus says that Egypt was eventually invaded by the Ethiopians, or attempted to be invaded by the Ethiopians, and Moses was a successful general. And that's what the allusion in Acts chapter 7 and verse 22 was that he was successful because he was a general who led the Egyptian army against the Ethiopians. No biblical justification for that necessarily, but just a little bit of historical context. The kids' material for this was interesting. Of course, it's a great story to think about. This is something we've always taught our children, but the application was, I can help others and take responsibility like Miriam did, no matter how young I am. And we didn't get into that with a lot of detail this morning, but there's certainly some application from there as well. We will pick up next week with pretty much chapter 2, the rest of chapter 2, the call of Moses and what takes place there if you want to look ahead and read ahead, and then certainly keep looking at Acts chapter 7, because that's a great resource as we think about what Stephen says there. So appreciate your good attention this morning, and we'll pick up there next week.